Thank you very, very much. And good afternoon to those of you who are in Israel. Good morning to those of you who are in the States, depending on where you are, different times of the morning. But it's a delight to be here. I want to begin by thanking the Beit Avichai for inviting me to do this. It's really a lot of fun. And we thought when we were thinking together about which Mishnah to do, we would try to do something that is relevant to the world in which we live and some of the questions that we're thinking about. As was just pointed out, there are many, many Mishnayot that would fall into that category. But we're going to look at one about the world of machloket, about disagreements and so on and so forth, which there is no shortage of in our world. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share the screen in a second, and you'll see a little PowerPoint, and I'll come back on in the middle. And then, of course, I'm not going to take all of the time, and we'll have time for questions and answers and discussion. But what I want to do basically is first go through the Mishnah and explain it, and then talk a little bit about one of the particular commentaries about Mishnah Ravenou Yonah on the Mishnah. Then we'll talk about one other thing that's going on. We'll look at a little Shulchan Aruch. We'll mix it up and match it up and see where we go. So let me just share the screen for a second. And you should now all have a shared screen. Looks good, I think, I hope. Yes, okay, great. All right, so we're gonna look at the whole notion of consensus or division, which our Mishnah is about. I'm sure that many of you on here know this Mishnah. It's a very famous Mishnah, as are all of Perkei Avot Mishnayot, but we'll get right into it and then we'll talk about it. Okay, just have to move the faces off the edge of my Mishnah here. Okay, so I'm gonna read it first in Hebrew, but we're gonna spend most of our time talking about it in English, of course. Just gonna make sure you guys are not covering my Mishnah here. Okay, here we go. Any dispute or every dispute that is for the sake of heaven, whatever that means, we'll come back to that in a minute. Sofa lihitkayem. Also not clear exactly what that means. It is going to endure, whatever that is. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim, the opposite, if it's not for the sake of heaven, if it is a disagreement not for the sake of heaven, en sofa lihitkayem, it is not destined to endure. What is this thing, a machloket, a disagreement that is for the sake of heaven? That is the disagreement of Hillel and Shammai in the Mishnah, and then later on, of course, quoted in the Gemara. And what was not for the sake of heaven, this is the disagreement between Korach and his Edah, his group. Obviously, most famous from Parashat Korach, but Korach and his sons are mentioned elsewhere in the Tanakh. Actually, elsewhere in the Tanakh, it actually says, "Uvnei Korach lo metu." Korach's sons did not die in the end. So the commentaries try to figure out how all that works, because in Parashat Korach, it sure looks like they do. But in any event, let's go back to what we do understand and what we don't understand. We clearly have something about a kind of a division here that seems good, like a machloket l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the sake of heaven. That certainly seems good. And a machloket she'ena l'shem shamayim, even if you don't understand the depth of the Mishnah, that certainly seems like something that's not ideal. Sofa lihitkayem, something that endures forever, seems good. So it's not entirely counterintuitive that the Mishnah would associate that it is destined to endure with a machloket that is for the sake of heaven. And it therefore seems not entirely unsurprising that something that's not destined to endure would be a machloket that is not for the sake of heaven. And then we have Hillel and Shammai, a very noble, principled set of disagreements in which Hillel usually takes the day, but not always. There are times when the halacha follows Shammai, whereas in Korach and his group, we pretty much know who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. It's not terribly hard to figure out. Now, the problem with this Mishnah is, of course, though, that it's more complicated than it seems on the surface, because when we think about it, when we think about disagreements are things that we like to figure out how to resolve and put aside. In other words, we think of ourselves, whether it's in work or in family or in a shul or in a political system, whatever it is, when we have a disagreement, what we want to do is resolve it. And a resolved disagreement is a good thing. And a disagreement that refuses to go away on the surface would seem to be a bad thing. So why is it that a disagreement for the sake of heaven does not get resolved, whereas a disagreement that is not for the sake of heaven does get resolved? That's the part of this Mishnah that seems to be counterintuitive, and that's exactly what Ravenou Yonah, who was one of the most famous commentators on the Mishnayot in general, on Avot particularly, tries to resolve. So we have here the commentary of Ravenou Yonah, It's in 2 slides, so we'll get to the second half in a second. Again, we'll read it in the Hebrew, we'll go into the English, and we'll see what Ravenou Yonah has to add here. But he's clearly addressing this question that we're asking, which is the counterintuitive part of the Mishnah, right? What is good about machloket not getting resolved? In what way is it positive for a disagreement to endure? Don't we want to resolve disagreements, put them behind us, and march on? That's what he's trying to address. So here he goes. Kol machloket v'chulei. Lomar ki ma she'amar kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim sofo litkayem. For what it says in the Mishnah that every argument that's for the sake of heaven, has heaven's name in this particular translation, it is destined to endure. Hakavana she'olam yitkaimu b'machloket hayom yachaloku b'davar echad u'machar b'davar acher. They are always going to be locked in their disagreement. Today, they're going to disagree about one thing, and then tomorrow, they're going to disagree about something else. So you have this duo. It could be Hillel and Shammai. It could be Korach v'chol dato. It could be us and a friend. It could be whatever, right? Whatever it is, what Ravenou Yonah says is that if it's a genuinely divine confrontation, a divine disagreement in some way, it's for the sake of heaven, then we're never going to really resolve it. We're going to resolve one way now. We're going to argue about something else tomorrow. People with whom we have actually a principled conversation or disagreement for the sake of heaven, we're actually always going to disagree with them. And we may resolve part 1 today, but we'll be on to something else tomorrow. ונמשך ביניהם כל ימי חייהם ולא עוד אלא שאורך ימים בשנות חיים יוסיפו להם. He adds a little flourish to this. In other words, ומחלוקת יהיה קיים ונמשך ביניהם כל ימי חייהם. Their disagreement is going to be in existence and continue between them all the days of their lives. And not only that, but length of days and years of life will be added to them. Is a very famous common phrase. In other words, they're actually going to get time added onto their life for their having been involved and engaged in this kind of a dispute, which again, when you think about it, is really kind of counterintuitive. Why would anybody have time added to their life for the great, zchut that they had of being involved in a confrontation that refused to be resolved? Then we have the other half here, but it's not for the sake of heaven. It's not going to endure. That's the quote from the Mishnah. Rather, they will cease in their first argument, they will end there and die there, as in the case with Korach. In other words, if it's not a disagreement for the sake of heaven, then what we're going to find is they're actually going to die, whether figuratively or literally. They're actually just going to sort of spend themselves completely on that first machloket, on that first disagreement. They're never going to move on to anything. It's a disagreement that actually kills the relationship. It's an agreement that either kills their lives or kills their ability to have a conversation, which again is kind of not what we would have expected, but we have to figure out now what's really going on. So again, I heard a couple of people ping and enter just a little bit after we got started, which is of course totally fine. We're just going to go back and summarize so far what we're working on here. We have this Mishnah. We have this Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot. Some chapters of Pirkei Avot, as many as you know, I'll just stop sharing for 1 sec. Some chapters of Pirkei Avot, as many of you know, are built around so-and-so said in the name of so-and-so, said in the name of so-and-so. We kind of get a continuum of masters and teachers and disciples, and so on and so forth. This chapter of Pirkei Avot is not organized that way. This chapter of Pirkei Avot begins being organized about numbers of things. There were 10 things like this. There were 7 things in this category. There were 4 things in that category. And several Mishnayot deal with 10, and several Mishnayot deal with categories of 7 such and such, and 7 such and such. Then it goes on to 4. There were 4 things and 4 things. And then it drops the numbers, and we get a kind of a series of aphorisms, of which our Mishnah is one. We just learned this interesting thing about disagreements. And again, for those who dropped in just a tiny little bit after we got started, what we're saying basically is that there is something wonderful about a disagreement for the sake of heaven. That makes sense. And how do we know that it's a disagreement for the sake of heaven? It never ends. Ironically, even though we tend to think in the modern world is what you really want to try to do is put a disagreement behind you, a disagreement for the sake of heaven never ends. It abides and endures, and says Ravenou Yonah, by virtue of your having engaged in a disagreement for the sake of heaven, you actually get time added onto your life. And presumably, what are you going to do with that time? You're going to actually disagree more. And Hillel and Shammai never resolved the disputes between them, whereas Korach and his followers, Korach and his clan, in the book of Numbers, obviously, they completely destroy themselves. They're destroyed. Korach is destroyed. They came very close to destroying the unity of the Jewish people. It's a raw power play in the story of Korach. In other words, a machloket shelo l'shem shamayim, a machloket she'ena l'shem shamayim, is a machloket that's not about anything noble. It's not about anything principled. It's about power or money or control or something else. And Hillel and Shammai were not arguing about power and control or money. They were arguing about something much more principled, and all sorts of commentaries have been given. Maybe Hillel was the one who represented more the common folk, and Shammai may have been the one who represented the more richer classes, the more powerful classes. That's something that Jacob Neusner and others argue. But regardless of what animates Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, it's clear they're both trying to figure out what the halacha should be. They're both trying to figure out, in other words, what's God's will? How would God want the Jewish people to behave in any number of things? What's pure and what's impure? How do you dance before a bride, and so on and so forth? So again, we have this notion that a machloket, when it is for the sake of heaven, is actually something good. Division is actually good. Disagreement is actually good. And consensus is actually bad when it is about a principled kind of an issue. Now, the question is really sort of, well, why would that be? I mean, we always talk about trying to put these things behind us. So why would this kind of a division be good? And we're going to go back to some sources here. And I want to take this opportunity to think a little bit about some of the disagreements that we're having about in this time of the horrendous coronavirus, which, again, I think that it's just wrong to mention any of this huge issue without pointing to the fact that there are many, many, many people who don't have the luxury of doing what we are doing at this very moment, which is to sit in the comfort of our homes or wherever we are, fairly confident that we know where tomorrow's meal is coming from. Thankfully, in most of our cases, not immediately touched by the immediate loss of anybody in our lives. And I just think it's not okay to talk about anything about the coronavirus without remembering that there are just infinite numbers of people out there suffering terribly. And we talked about how Israel's doing fairly well. That's true. And the numbers of sick people, thank God, are going down. And the number of deaths, thank God, has been relatively minimal relative to America. I mean, per capita, America is about 10 times per capita of what Israel's had per capita. But even in Israel, we ought to recognize, we went from 2 months ago, what was a 3-point-something% unemployment rate, which for all intents and purposes is no unemployment, to now an unemployment rate that is closing in on 30%. Those aren't statistics. Those are families where people get into bed at the end of the day, ridiculously stressed because they literally don't know where they're getting tomorrow's meal for their kids from. And we all know this, and I'm not telling you anything that you haven't already read, that you haven't already discussed, that you haven't already felt. But I do just feel that it's wrong in this time to talk about Corona and about anything having to do with Corona without owning for a moment the degree to which most of us on this conversation, or what will become a conversation shortly, are very privileged, and the degree to which this has wrought untold suffering in the world, in Israel, but even more so all across the world, and including the countries that many of us in this conversation still live in. And for those of us who are Americans in Israel, a country that many of us came from. Now, there's been a lot of deliberation about shul in the time of Corona, and that deliberation has taken many different forms. Part of it was about Zoom, for example, right? I mean, we're all on Zoom at the moment. There was a big disagreement about Zoom around the time of Pesach. A number of Orthodox rabbis in Israel, mostly of Mizrahi descent, actually said you could use Zoom on the Seder table. Now, they were very clear. You couldn't touch the computer. You couldn't turn the computer on. You couldn't log on to Zoom. But you could somehow, like sort of as part of the ornament of your Seder table, so to speak, you could have a Seder plate and wine cups and a kos Eliyahu Hanavi and a little laptop, which is exactly what we actually did for my mom, who wasn't able to leave her residence. And a lot of the Orthodox establishment responded right away that you're not allowed to do that. And I think a lot of us have read about that, and we've sort of, hashed that out. There have been other issues, for example, having to do with whether or not Zoom can be a shul. Many people in America, certainly in the Reform movement, and the Reconstructionist movement, and the Conservative movement, have been doing streaming of services long before this whole crisis came, and many more began to do it once this crisis became a real crisis, because people really couldn't go to shul. And again, I don't want it today to get into a conversation about the halachic details of why it's okay, why it's not okay. That's not for us to discuss here. But I want to try to raise this again to the level of principle. And the whole issue of shul and going to shul, of course, has had a somewhat darker side to it, particularly when both in America, mostly in Brooklyn, but not only, and in Israel, mostly in Bnei Brak and Yerushalayim, but not only, people have gotten caught up in the whole conversation about the ways in which the ultra-Orthodox community has comported itself. So I want to be very clear here about one thing, and people may not agree with me, and that's totally fine. My own view is that in both countries, there have been moments in which the ultra-Orthodox community as a whole, or individual members of the ultra-Orthodox community as specific individuals, comported themselves in ways that are simply not okay. So for example, when somebody who is a Haredi person from Israel flies to America knowing that he's been tested, finds out when he gets to America that he is positive, and because he doesn't have health insurance, which is a huge issue, we all understand, gets on a plane without telling anybody else that he's sick, he's got the coronavirus, and gets on a plane and flies 12 hours with other people on the flight, and it's only, the authorities are only alerted because his family actually calls and tells them. There's something about that that is just simply not okay. I mean, if one of the principal values of Jewish life is pikuach nefesh, which is to save people's lives and not to put them in danger, then that is simply behavior that is just unacceptable. I mean, by the way, we can all understand, right? He went to America to make a living. That's where his job was. And he got back on the plane because he had no health insurance. This wasn't a person who decided to fly just for the fun of it. And you can really understand his own agmat nefesh in terms of making the decisions that he made. But at the end of the day, it's still not okay to get on an airplane knowing that you've tested positive and not to tell anyone. But so there have been all kinds of cases. We know about the two recent funerals in Brooklyn. We know the whole controversy about Mayor de Blasio and what he said about the Jewish community, and how certain people in America felt that he was really singling out the Jewish community as a whole unfairly. Some people actually have accused him in recent days of fomenting anti-Semitism. I want to get away from all of that. Those are conversations that will keep us going for quite some time, and we can certainly open it up to that. But I want to ask a different kind of a question, not a halachic question and not a political question. What might there be for us to learn from the Haredi community and its inability to say, okay, we got it, we're not going to shul. There's a virus, there is a serious physical, biological danger. We're going to close down our yeshivot. We're going to close down our shuls. We're not going to do it. Now, most of us reacted not positively to that. And there's a little Haredi shtibel right across the street from my house. So I can watch them every morning as they're davening. And now in Israel, we're allowed to have 19 people, up to 19 people in shul, as long as they're separated by 2 meters. And I see what happens on Mondays and Thursdays. They are separated by 2 meters, but then somebody brings the Torah out and everybody gathers around the Torah, kisses the Torah. And you kind of have to ask yourself, guys, don't you read the paper? Whatever. Now, it's very easy to be critical, but I want to try to do the opposite now and look at something just a little bit different from a little bit of a different perspective. So I want to go back to something now in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law. Code of Jewish Law has obviously 4 parts. I think most people know that. The first part of which Orach Chaim takes us through first the cycle of the day, and then the cycle of the week, then the cycle of the year, and the cycle of our lives, and talks about all kinds of Jewish rituals. Among them, right here in Orach Chaim 55, what does it mean to be in a minyan? What makes up a minyan? Where do you actually have to be? Now, we're going to see in a minute that it describes everybody has to be b'makom echad, in one place. So we'll read it first in Hebrew, then we'll go to the English. And by the way, I want to give credit where credit is due. All these screenshots are taken from Sefaria online. Sefaria, if you don't know it, is an unbelievable resource. It's a group of relatively young-ish people who have sought to do something extraordinary, which is to put pretty much all of the Jewish literary world in terms of classical religious sources online. In many cases translated, not in all cases, but in many cases translated. It's got an amazing source sheet builder, which I didn't use for this, But the people who have put Safari together have done an extraordinary thing for the Jewish world, and I didn't want to take screenshots off of their website without at least giving them credit. It's free. You can go on. You should have an account. If you don't have an account, it's really amazing. But here's what Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim says in Nun Hey. Tzarich sheyu kol asara b'makom echad v'shatz imahem. This is the first easy part. They all 10 people have to be in one place. That's the critical word, in one place. B'shliach tzibur, the shatz has to be standing with them. Now, what happens if someone is standing in the doorway? I mean, allow your imaginations to run wild. People are pacing back and forth at the back of shul. That's always me, right? And it gets a little crowded, and you want your space, and you step back just to where the doorway is. Maybe it's the doorway to the hallway or the social hall or whatever it is. Are you in or are you out? והעומד בתוך הפתח מן האגף לחוץ, דהיינו כשסוגר את הדלת במקום שפה פנימית שלו והדלת ולחוץ כלחוץ. So, and the one who stands in the middle of the doorway, between a part of the building and the outside, whether the outside of that room to the outside or the outside that room to some other part of the building, such as when the one closes the door, one is in place from the inside, the lip of the thickness of the door. In other words, if the door were to close, essentially, if most of you was inside, then you're considered inside. And if the door were to close, hypothetically, and most of where you are would be outside, then you're considered outside and you don't count. We're going to skip one paragraph and then go on. Now imagine a situation where half the people or some of the people are inside the shul, and some of the people are standing outside of the shul. Let's say there's 5 inside and 5 outside, or 4 and 5, or 5 and 4, it doesn't make any difference. And the Shliach Tzibur, the communal prayer leader, is standing right in the middle of the groups, the 2 groups. Hu mitzarfan, he joins them together for a minyan. Now the Shulchan Aruch then goes on and talks about, what about if people are outside the window? So outside the window, the answer is actually very interesting. If you're outside the window, you can join the minyan, but you're not counted in the 10. If you want to answer Amen, you can. You want to be part of Kaddish, you can. But you can't be part of the 10. You're outside. The 10 have to be b'makom echad. Now, this became a really important issue with the beginning of the pandemic for a series of very important reasons. So first of all, there's people who are saying Kaddish, right? There are people who are saying Kaddish for, God forbid, parents or a spouse, or God forbid, a child. And it's desperately important for them to be able to say Kaddish. And they don't want to have somebody else say Kaddish for them. I mean, ironically, the situation here was where we had these hotels of people that were put together because everybody was corona positive. In those hotels, they were allowed to have minyanim. So you could call somebody from that minyan and say, would you say Kaddish for me? And that was, people did that. And, that's totally fine. But a lot of people didn't want to do that. They wanted to say Kaddish for the person that they loved themselves. So the question became, well, why can't I actually make this Zoom thing into a minyan? I mean, after all, I can see everybody. I can hear everybody. Now, according to my screen, we have 97 people online at the moment. But we can't see everybody, of course. Well, we could shuffle through all the pages. But if we had 12 or 13 or 14 or 16 people, usually on my screen up to 25 and other people's screens up to 49, we actually can see and hear everyone. So people said, well, why isn't that good enough? I mean, what makes a makom a makom? What makes a place a place? And I'll give you an example of other ways in which, we have kind of legal systems have changed over the course of time. What makes a signature, right? If I sign a fax and then I fax the signed thing back to the original sender, now I know that nobody knows what a fax machine is anymore, but there was this machine once called a fax. And believe it or not, it wasn't always obvious legally that faxed signatures were legitimate signatures. It changed after fax machines became somewhat more common and people used them all the time. Then there was actually legislation, from what I'm told. I'm not a lawyer, but I checked this out before this class with some lawyer friends of mine. It was actually done not by court cases, but by legislation saying that a fax would actually be a legitimate signature for conducting and transacting business. Now, what about a digital signature? Most of us on this call have been in situations where we've been asked to actually type our name in a certain little field. It looks nothing like our signature, but that typed digital signature is actually considered a legally binding signature in certain cases. That was actually decided in court cases, which is really interesting, right? So what constitutes a place why doesn't that change just in the same way that what constitutes a signature might change? Many of us on this call were not able to go to Shul in Purim. In Israel in Purim, it was already getting to the point that the government had not said you cannot go, but there were already a lot of people who were not going. I had just gotten back from the APAC policy conference and was told that I had to be in isolation for 2 weeks, which was Purim fell during that time. And so I couldn't go to Shul. I mean, even if I'd been willing to go to Shul, I couldn't go to Shul because I was in isolation. And people paskined that you could listen to Megillah and say Amen over Zoom. They said it wasn't ideal, but it was doable. And so they said that the hearing of the Megillah was actually okay to do over Zoom. Hearing a shofar, people have said, is not okay. Some people say, by the way, even over a microphone, although there's a lot of halachic dispute about that as well. But in any event, my point is that technology has changed things here and there. So why not change what is a place? Why not say, you know what, this terrible, horrible pandemic has forced us into a situation where people want to be able to say Kaddish. People want to hear the Torah reading. On Mondays and Thursdays, Shabbat's a separate story altogether. But on Mondays and Thursdays, people want to hear Torah reading. So why can't we just call this a place? And I don't know, some people will be together in the shul, but people, whatever. Why can't we do that? And here I want to bring us back to the Mishnah that we're talking about and suggest the following. I think the Haredim are actually onto something pretty darn important. Again, I'm not trying to excuse anybody's behavior. There was behavior here that was just simply not okay. And I'm sure we all have very strong feelings about it. And this is not the place to have that conversation. But here's what I think we have learned. This is just one piece from the New York Times, but you can find articles about this in every serious publication. The Washington Post has been covering this. The Wall Street Journal has been covering this. The Atlantic has been covering this. I mean, everybody's talking about it. But we're all dealing with loneliness. And what's interesting about the loneliness that we're feeling is that we're on screens all day long. We are talking to people all day long. We're not in solitary confinement. We're not sitting by ourselves in a dark dungeon or a dark cell. For example, the way my friend and colleague Natan Sharansky was forced to be, really, right? I mean, there is such a thing as the horror of solitary confinement. None of us are in that. Even, God forbid, those of us who are living entirely by ourselves, which is a horrible situation and which was horrible for people at the Seder and makes Shabbat very, very difficult and so on and so forth. Even those people theoretically are not entirely by themselves because they can do this. We can talk to each other. I, like many of you, for work, am literally on Zoom from morning till night. From 8 in the morning till 8 at night with a few breaks here and there, I'm on Zoom. And then in the evening, my wife and I have dates every night with another couple, usually, and we call them quarantinis, right? So everybody takes out a bottle of wine. There's 2 of us here. There's 2 of somebody else somewhere else. In a couple of hours, we're doing it with friends of ours who are in LA. They're going to have to drink pretty early in the day, but they'll manage. But when we do it with people in Israel, it's all the same time. And we see pretty much, except for Friday nights, obviously, we see a different couple or different friends every single night of the week. And yet somebody invited us over for a Yom Ha'atzmaut barbecue. They live just a couple of streets away from us. And they said, we're going to have just 3 couples, us and 2 other couples. We're all going to sit really far apart in the backyard. You want to wear a mask, wear a mask, but we'll all at least see each other. And I was dying to go. I was like, I said to my wife, let's go. It's just 2 blocks away and up the street. They're being really careful, just like we're being really careful. Let's go. And then she pointed out correctly, she said, we can't go because on Yom Ha'atzmaut, there's the 100-meter rule. You're really not supposed to do it. And, you can't be critical of other people for violating the rules if you're not going to stick by the rules. And I thought she was right. So we told our friends that we couldn't go, and we didn't. But somebody invited us this coming Shabbos lunch for the same exact arrangement. Them plus 2 couples, everybody's going to sit pretty far apart. We'll just sort of take our plates and sit, but at least we'll see each other. And I got to tell you, when the invitation for Shabbos lunch came over a WhatsApp, it felt like a huge relief, like, oh my God, finally some human contact. But then I said to myself, but wait, like I have human contact all day long. I'm looking at people and hearing people and talking to people and learning from people all day long. What's really the issue? And then I was struck by something. That the Haredim, again, I'm not excusing anybody's behavior, But they modeled for us something that I think we can turn into a machloket shelo l'shem shamayim into a machloket l'shem shamayim. We can take a disagreement that was just about ugly stuff, nasty stuff. Why are you guys humiliating us? Why are you guys endangering us? Why are you not following the rules of the state? Come on, it's gross, it's not okay. And we can take it and we can ask ourselves, beyond the obvious criticism that I personally think is in place, and some people on our call may disagree, all good. But beyond the obvious criticism, what can we learn from them? What can we turn, how can we turn this conversation with them into a conversation, or not with them, but theoretically with them, right? How can we turn this conversation into a machloket l'shem shamayim? And here's the question I want to ask. What did they teach us? Or what could they have taught us? Or what could we have learned from their community that we ourselves didn't know? And here's what I think we know 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 8 weeks, depending on how many weeks each of us has been doing this. Here's what we know. This is not human contact. It's really not. We see each other, that we do, but it's not human contact. We are desperate to be in the proximity of other human beings. This is great. We all get to peek into each other's studies or dining rooms or living rooms and, say, oh, I have those books. I don't have those books. How come their books are organized? My books aren't organized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When our house is a disaster, then we put on one of those little Zoom artificial backgrounds. I didn't know you could do that at the beginning. In the first meeting that I had with a whole bunch of Shalem students, like what, they're all in Hawaii? They had all taken that little, palm tree background, and it took me, I'm an idiot. So it took me a little bit longer to figure out they weren't all on the same island in Hawaii, whatever. But what we're learning is, I have it now set to a grid so I can see 25 different faces, et cetera. And it's great to see all of you. And there's probably another couple of pages of people sitting there too. And it's great. Yeah, and it's wonderful. And it's a lot better than some sort of faceless, voiceless conference call that we used to do in the olden days. But what we learned is that it's not human contact. It's just really not. And so in their hunger to say, I don't want to shut down these yeshivot, because whatever the kids might learn at home from their parents or somebody else, learning a text in a class full of kids is different. By the way, we should also be fully cognizant of the fact that in some cases, those yeshivot give those kids their only hot day of the meal, a hot meal of the day, only hot meal of the day. So part of the reticence to shut down those yeshivot was those kids need to eat. I mean, that was something that not many of us were aware of, but we should be. But let's even just think of shuls for a second, or of meetings. In other words, what the Haredi community might have taught us a little bit is that when you and I look at this screen that I'm looking at right now, and we say, yeah, come on, it's a modern world, it's the 21st century. Why not call this a makom? Why not call this a place to satisfy the requirements of the Shulchan Aruch? Let's call this a minyan. Why not? The Haredi world might have taught us, no, this need to be in shul, it's not only narrow-minded. It's not only, I'm not saying it's narrow-minded at all. It's not only mechanical. It's kind of an awareness of a dimension of human life and human behavior that many of us who are willing to jump automatically to Zoom and say, come on, let's call this a makom, weren't aware of, and they implicitly were. This is great, but it's not a place. This is great, but it's not human contact. And when we take a walk out on the street, even with our masks and some of us our gloves and whatever, and we see another couple or other people walking on the other side of the street on the sidewalk, there's a way in which it feels like a huge bracha to see human beings. I walked this last Shabbos afternoon. My wife and I don't go out all that much. We really try not to. But I went this Shabbos afternoon to go visit my mom. She sat outside and I sat 2 meters away from her and all that. She was in a mask and I was in a mask. But to see people on the street was somehow good for the soul. To see parents walking with their kids, even if, by the way, the kids were wearing masks. And I have to say that I looked at, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old wearing a mask, or my kids in Boston send me a picture of my granddaughter learning how to ride a bike. She's wearing a helmet and a mask. Part of my heart breaks. I mean, is this going to become the new normal? Right? Is this going to be the world in which we're going to live and our children and our grandchildren are going to grow up, in which not seeing people's smiles is going to be the normal? I mean, if that's the case, then the world is in much worse shape than any of us want to acknowledge. So hopefully that won't be the case. But what I think, I have been humbled, but my original impatience with the traditional world that wouldn't look at the Shulchan Aruch and say, come on, 2020, a makom now has changed. And 4 weeks or 5 weeks ago, if somebody had said to me, what do you think the halacha should be? I would have said, we need some brave Orthodox rabbi, because that's the community that cares about these kinds of things mostly, not entirely, but mostly. Most people in the Orthodox community are waiting for rabbis to say it, whereas in the other communities, they've already moved forward on that. So it's not an issue as much there. But we need somebody in that community to have some, have some guts. Grab the bull by the horns and say, yep, a makom is now different than what we used to think a makom was. And I want to say now, in the beginning of May, I think I was wrong. I think we could learn from that community. They understood what we didn't, or what I didn't understand back then. This is great, but it's not a makom. And therefore, I think what we want to try to do with instances like the Haredi community, what probably many of us were frustrated by, and some of us perhaps not, is to say, when we disagree with them, what's the part of the disagreement that could be really principled? What could we learn from them? We know what they think, what we think they could learn from us, about how science works, about how microbes work, about how social distancing was the right thing to do. Even, by the way, how it's important to be tied into the internet and get news so that we don't have a lag of 3 or 4 days before word gets to us and so forth. But that's easy, what everybody else should learn from us. Harder part is, what could we have learned from them? And I think that we could raise this to a principled conversation now. What does their religious world have to teach us about human contact? What does their religious world have to teach us about a life in which the day is peppered, morning, afternoon, and evening, if not more than that, by instances in which you simply feel you have to be with other people? There is something fundamentally wrong with the world and wrong with your life and wrong with your religiosity even. If you think you can approach God 3 times a day, day after day after day, without the proximity of people. I think I've learned that from them. And so when I think about this Mishnah, and I'll begin to wrap it up here, when I think about this Mishnah, I actually find myself humbled by the Shulchan Aruch and humbled by the Haredi community, that they were onto something that I didn't understand 6 weeks ago when I thought this was actually, if not perfectly fine, then a heck of a lot better than nothing. It is a heck of a lot better than nothing, but it's not really good enough. So it looks like on one sense, we're going one way, they're going the other way, and we're just this and they're just that. We have nothing to learn from each other. And I think what our Mishnah is asking us to do here is to say, really, maybe there is something we can actually learn from each other. Maybe there's a way in which, of course, we think they have something to learn from us, but we also have something to learn from them. And therefore, we want to go back to what we learned from Ravenou Yonah, which is that every argument that's for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. Why is it not ideal that arguments get resolved? Why do we actually think that it's a good thing when a principled argument doesn't get resolved, but it endures forever? Because in principled arguments, we actually clarify principles of life. Principled arguments are not about the kinds of things that Korach and his followers were about, which was power grabbing. They are about what Hillel and Shammai were about, which is, what does God want from us? What does human nature require of us? Whether it's kashrut or Shabbat or weddings, whatever the case may be. In other words, in what ways can arguments actually help us to elucidate really serious principles about life? And I'll just say one quick thing about this, which is that I think, especially in America, but it's also an issue here in Israel, but it's more of an issue in America. Political conversation has completely lost the ability to try to understand what's the insight that the other side has. I mean, there are actually polls in America, which we thank God don't have here, of how many Republicans wouldn't want their kid to marry a Democrat, and how many Democrats wouldn't want their kid to marry a Republican. There's nobody that's done a poll. How many people who voted for Likud wouldn't want their kid to marry somebody from, Yesh Atid? No such polls have been conducted because nobody would care. If your kid marries somebody who they love and is a good person, it's all good. I think in America, we have allowed political labels to enable us to kind of think, yeah, there's nothing wrong with them. If they could vote for that person, or they don't see how great that person is, there's just something fundamentally wrong with them, morally, DNA-wise, or in some other way. And we so get stuck on, would you vote for him? Wouldn't you vote for him? Would you vote for this party? Wouldn't you vote for this party? That we never ask ourselves, the people who vote the opposite way from what we do, what do they see about the world that we don't see? What troubles them about the world that doesn't trouble us? Why is it that the red middle votes so differently from the blue edges? What are they all stupid? Are they all immoral? Are they all uneducated? They're not. So what about our world doesn't appeal to them? What about our sense of fairness strikes them as fundamentally unfair? What about their sense of what America is about strikes us as being really problematic for America? We're not necessarily going to convince each other, but instead of calling each other names and using labels, what I think this Mishnah is saying to us is we want to turn every machloket, when we can, into a machloket l'shem shamayim. We want to try to make our disagreements with other peoples about principle. And so that's what Hillel and Shammai always did. I think we could even describe the disagreement between us and the Haredi communities, even if we were annoyed, and even if they felt put upon, we could raise it to levels of principles in a way that I think would actually enrich our conversation. I think we could certainly do that when it comes to politics in certain cases. And I think, quite frankly, that that's something that we all ought to do. So I'm going to stop the share now, and we'll talk about, obviously, wishing each other the two things that matter most, staying safe and healthy when we're done. But let's open it up now a little bit for conversations and questions. I'll try to manage it through the chat, and then my co-host, I don't see where she went. Oh, there she is. She moved down a few rows, but she'll try to unmute you, and then we can take it from there. So there's a thank you for that. But if you can either do the little wave thing or whatever, or then we'll let you unmute yourself. Whatever we're going to do here technologically, and happy to take comments, questions, things that we can all learn from each other. Not everybody all at once. Come on. I see a hand. I have to see who it is. It's a name. Julie.
Yeah. Today in Israel, would you say that a makom is a parking lot, a street, an apartment complex with balconies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I love the question because I see in your smile that we're experiencing the same thing, right? I mean, yeah. I wrote about this in Times of Israel a couple of weeks ago in a little piece called Only Here. But nice. Right, I mean, we went up to our balcony and we were just thinking of like taking in some evening air on Shabbat, and then we heard all these voices coming from all of the various buildings, and we were in a way, and they did say Kaddish and they did say Baruch Hu. So clearly those people. Now, I couldn't see them. It may be that enough people really could see each other. They were definitely not in the same place, but maybe they really could see each other, and they clearly decided that. So I think like that's a community where, yeah, a parking lot. Now, a parking lot's less problematic halachically because everybody is sort of in the same space and everybody knows you can daven outside. I mean, people have been davening outside forever and ever. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that this reality has pushed us. Maybe there are intermediate realities between a shul and Zoom. I think, those of us in Israel have been privileged.
We're blessed.
To see that. We've been very blessed to see people kind of pushing the envelope and reimagining makom. Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I know that for me, and I'm sure for you too, witnessing some of this has been unbelievably moving. And just really feeling like, it would be nice in a lot of ways to have a house and a front yard and a backyard and a driveway and a garage like we used to. And some days I really miss a garage to put all our junk. But there's a way in which not having a driveway or a backyard or a garage means that we all actually look onto that same space. Yeah, I mean, in our building, on the other side of the building, we all come out together and we sing Shalom Aleichem together every Friday night. And it's really interesting. It's just nice. It's lovely. And I think the building is getting along a lot better when we sing Shalom Aleichem together than when we used to deal with all kinds of other, apartment building kinds of things. So yeah, Julie, I think it's a great point. We're all pushing the envelope here. Yeah, we're all learning a lot. And you don't know, by the way, what's going to be the halachic implications of this down the road. I mean, it may be that we're thinking, okay, this epidemic, please God, will be over soon. And we're probably going to go back to the old normal. But we're not going back to the old normal in a lot of other ways, right? And I think it's very likely that people are not going to hop on planes the way that they used to for a very, very, very long time. And people are going to be much more aware of what they do in public and what they touch in public and how close they are to people. And, we're going to take a lot of this with us for a very long time. Hopefully, we can take some of this creative Jewish imagination that this has forced us into also And maybe it's the next generation that will see, how makom gets worked out, practically in a different way. Yeah, we'll see that. But I think it's a great point. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Put yourself in. Is that somebody raising their hand?
Yeah.
The one that says Debbie. Yes. It doesn't look like Debbie raising a hand, but okay.
This is Debbie. I'm Seth. Yes, I have a question. I happen to comment first. I happen to agree with your conclusion with regard to being in the presence of somebody is a very different feeling. However, we're also perhaps taking the perspective of our generations. For a younger generation, given that so many of them live in more of a virtual world, and they will describe virtual friendships, etc., I would have a feeling that their sensibility to, I need to be with somebody in real as opposed to virtually, does not make quite the same sense to them that it might make to us. So the question is, moving forward in terms of the halakha, are we describing the halakha for our generations or for a future generation? That's a really, really interesting point. There was an article on the front page. I don't know what a front page is anymore, but fairly high up on the New York Times website yesterday, how to date in Corona. Now, I mean, I'm not interested, but thank God my wife's upstairs. But people who actually, they meet each other online, but then you're not gonna be able to see each other forever or for a very long time. What are things that you can do together online? It was interesting. So I mean, that's really a very different world. You're right. I mean, a lot of young people actually conduct a huge part of their lives online, and maybe it really will be different for them. It's really very, very possible. I don't know. So what you're trying to say in a very nice way is that I'm old and a dinosaur, and I accept that. That's okay. But I've been told worse, and it's just true. I have to say, it's just true. Those of us on this call who are of a certain age and older, when we were beginning to read these articles at the beginning of the pandemic, if you were X age or up, then you're in a certain category. It's like, oh my God, the fact that I wear jeans and a t-shirt to work doesn't actually make me not in that category. I'm actually in that category. So we're all confronting things about age too, or at least a lot of us are in a very real way. Yeah, I think it's a generational thing, and how people will paskin remains to be seen. I mean, there's a whole, I don't want to open up this whole can of worms, but I can tell you that I see in Orthodox congregations in the States, not all, but some, that have younger rabbis, the attitude to the LGBTQ community is very different than it was when I was in college or I was growing up. It's not saying that anybody's given a heter. I'm not saying that, but the engagement with this community and the way in which people speak to and about this community is very, very different. And I can tell you for a fact that I've spoken to some of my Orthodox rabbi colleagues who've said, my community comes back from college, the old way of talking about that community, that won't fly with them anymore. Regardless of what I think is right or wrong, they're in a different place. And either our community is going to change its nomenclature and change the way it talks, or they're going to be gone. And I don't want them to go. They're not themselves necessarily part of the LGBTQ community, but they care a lot about how people talk. And so I think, yeah, there's lots of generational changes, which we're going to see this working out. And you're right, maybe the halakha will change in different kinds of ways. By the way, some of you may have seen some American Jewish organizations were tracking this, at least for the first few weeks of the pandemic. There were many, many more people in shul Friday night online than prior had actually gone to shul in person, which is really, really interesting, right? It's just really interesting. In other words, now some of that may be because people are so worried and so frightened and so unsettled that you just want to be part of a community, even if normally that's not what you did. But how many people don't go to shul because, you got to get dressed, you got to go out, you got to look decent. Whereas in your home, you can be in jeans and a nice shirt. I will confess that at the beginning of the pandemic, especially, many days went by and I changed from one pair of LL pajamas to another pair of LL pajamas. Luckily, I have quite a large collection after many years of traveling too much. And I was, even for Shabbos, I will say, this is an era of great honesty. We're all being very honest with each other. So I will say, even for Shabbat,
it wasn't pajamas, but it was not really the way we normally dress for Shabbat. It was really not, believe me. Now, largely because we're always usually having guests or being guests. But then the Seder came. And I said to my wife, well, the only person who's going to see us is my mom. And even she is only going to see from the table level up, unless I stand to make Kiddush or something. And then I said, no, I just can't do it. Even I just can't do it. I put on a nice pair of dress black pants and a nice white shirt and a pair of good shoes. Like I dressed up for the Seder, even there was nobody there. But our standards do change in all kinds of ways. Somebody told me that her major question each morning is, what should I wear to the living room today? We're all dealing with all different kinds of questions, and it's hard. So what the halachic implications of this are going to be, what the communal implications of this are going to be, what the interpersonal, it's all going to be really very different. And I guess what I think our Mishnah that we're studying today would say to us is, even if we're going to disagree with each other, let's try to drill down and say, what's that person's principled position? What's the principle undergirding it? Let's not argue. Let's not say that is shul, that isn't shul. Let's get into, well, what is shul? What are our needs? And then, like Seth said, maybe our needs change from generation to generation. Could very well be. I see a couple of questions here. One of them is, Haredim don't have TVs. So I'll tell you something very interesting about Haredim not having TVs. And here's where being dan l'chavzchut is really important. And again, I want to make it very clear. I was as put out with those communities as many other people were. I mean, I was really enraged. Forget that the fact, by the way, it's not fair to the policemen. I actually work with a few people at Shalem who are married to police officers. And why should those people have to go into these crowds and tussle with them and expose themselves because people refuse to follow the law? It's just not okay. It's not fair. We have one student we have a number of students at Shalem who come from Haredi families. One of them is a woman who's no longer, she was never really Haredi. Her mother kind of became Haredi after she left the house. But her mother lives in Bnei Brak. She's the real deal. She's USDA choice Haredi. And this young woman said to me, you have to, and she was appalled also. She said, but as this person who's mentioning this, Jerry Holt, said, that's true. She says, my mother does not have a smartphone. And my mother does not own a television. And my mother owns a laptop, which she uses for work. She gets on, she gets off. She does not surf the web. So she really, for a few days, actually had no idea. And then think about how much information all of us squeezed out of the internet those first days, reading everywhere we possibly could. How is it communicated? How long can it last on shelves? Can it be airborne? Can it be this? I mean, we were all reading that stuff. And we were all dying to know. We all, by the way, now know how little we know. I mean, in all seriousness, we just don't know. They said a few weeks ago that kids can't get it. Turns out kids can get it. They said a few weeks ago that kids don't transmit it. Turns out kids do transmit it. They said if you're in your 30s or your 40s and you get it, you're going to probably be okay. But now it's turning out that kids in their 30s and 40s, not kids, but young adults in their 30s and 40s are having strokes. Nobody was talking about that 4 weeks ago, and now it's all of a sudden, it's in the newspaper. So we're learning a tremendous amount, and we're all aware and changing our behaviors based on a constant flow of information. What if we didn't have that constant flow of information? And I think that Jerry's point is very well taken. I mean, in some cases, by the way, they're going to have to ask themselves, is there a moral obligation not to be separated from the power grid or the water grid of information? I mean, they would never want to live not being on the water grid. They would never want to live not being on the power grid. Maybe they can't live anymore not being on the information grid, so to speak. But I understand the problem with the internet. We all know what's out there. There's a lot of disgusting things on the internet. And some of it's been Zoom bombed. We've actually seen that happen too. So one can understand that community also. Just want to read another question here. Yes, Chaim Waxman said something here. Critically important, unbelievably powerful, right? All those parents who said, I have to go visit my son's grave on Yom HaZikaron. And the state said, we'll go 2 days earlier. And they said, no, I'm going on Yom HaZikaron. It's a very similar kind of thing. Place, I mean, what difference does it make really if you're there, right? I mean, it makes a huge difference. And what difference does it make if it's actually on Yom HaZikaron? It makes a huge difference. So what we're learning is that the Jewish tradition's insight into both time and place is really, really profound. We have all known for a very long time that Judaism has had very, very smart things to say about time, right? And we've all heard it said 1,000 times that with Churban Beit HaMikdash, with the destruction of the temple, what we did is we substituted sacred time for sacred space, right? If they had taken away our sacred space, we were going to institute sacred time. So we couldn't go to the Beit HaMikdash, but we could set aside Shabbat, Chagim, and so on and so forth. And there's a way in which that's really true, right? Being in Galut, we didn't, Europe, Spain, wherever it was back in the days. And I'm using the term Galut not in a pejorative way. They themselves spoke about Galut that way. Didn't turn off my phone. Too bad. My apologies. They themselves, and by the way, I can tell you, it was my granddaughter calling me. So it's tremendous self-control on my part to have to call her back. But in any event, it's about the time in the afternoon when we read her stories in Boston. But in any event, right? I'm not saying Galut in a Zionist pejorative way. Like, that's what they said, right? Because of our sins, we were exiled. But even in that quote unquote exiled, we learned to create sacred space. We learned to create, even outside of Israel, cemeteries that speak to us very powerfully. We learned to create, even outside of Israel, shuls, where we learned that this kind of human contact is really very, very necessary. And so, yes, it's all true. I think it's a great point. One last amount of people. We don't have TVs, but the stars of Shtisel were amazed about the amount of. Yes. Yes. I mean, the stars of Shtisel were amazed at how many people from the Haredi world recognized them on the street, which is a great, right? They don't have TVs, but they recognized the Shtisel cast. That's true. I mean, there's something funny about that, and we all get that. I think the time is running out, so I'll make one last point since somebody mentioned Shtisel. I think Shtisel fits here really perfectly. I mean, okay, so some Haredim were watching Shtisel, or they saw it afterwards, they watched it online, or whatever, all good. I went to a restaurant in Tel Aviv, happened to be kosher, but it doesn't really attract a terribly frum crowd. It attracts a very, very, very trendy Tel Aviv crowd. It was a couple of years ago. Shtisel was kind of in its peak. And my wife and I were there waiting for another couple to join us. And they were a little bit late, all good. They had great scotch at this place. We were perfectly happy. And right next to us was a table of these young Israeli guys, the really tight crew neck t-shirts. They were all, they all had little tattoos on them, a very different world from the world I live in. And you can't make this stuff up. One group sat down with the other, they just arrived late, and they said, hey, manishma ma koreh? And the other guy said, Chaste Hashem. Now, he's tattooed, he's got an earring, the whole shebang, and I thought, it was a strange world when these tattooed, pierced guys are saying Chaste Hashem, and I knew exactly where they learned the phrase. They learned the phrase Shtisel. So now the question becomes, why are so many non-Haredi people watching Shtisel? Because there's something fascinating about that community. Because those people in Tel Aviv who leave their tall steel and glass towers and drive home in their Lexus to Ramat Aviv and then go into their very nice homes, they don't want to live in Bnei Brak and Mea Shearim, but they may leave that tall steel tower and go into that beautiful home in Ramat Aviv and not feel entirely fulfilled. And they see in these communities people who are poor, really poor, who live, right? Part of the reason the Magefa spread in Bnei Brak and in Mea Shearim is because if you're a family of 10 kids and you live in a tiny apartment, it's going to spread. That's what's going to happen. And they ask themselves, these people in Ramat Aviv, why are they so happy? What's the magic sauce? Why have they been able to choose poverty and live in a way that I don't personally want to live, but they seem smechim bechelkam. They seem somehow at peace with their lot in the world. And how come I have everything? And when I get in my car at the end of the day to drive home, I don't feel that. And that really brings us right back to where we were when we began to talk about what this Mishnah might mean in our own day and age. It's a community that I personally, Daniel Gordis, I don't want to join that community. A lot of reasons, attitudes to women, attitudes to not for me. It's just not for me. But is there what to learn from it? I think there really is. And I think, therefore, the Mishnah in Mefrakei of Pirkei Avot, with which we'll conclude, when it says that we want is a machloket l'shem shamayim, We want a machloket that's not going to get resolved, even though that sounds counterintuitive. And it's not going to get resolved precisely because it's about the kinds of questions that should never be resolved. What's dignity about? What's intimacy about? What's loyalty about? What's caring about? What's community about? How do we show community? How do we make all these things happen? If we disagree with other people about that, but we keep arguing about it in a principled kind of a way, then says this Mishnah, we are not like Korach and his followers, we are like Hillel and Shammai, and our argument will continue forever and ever, and according to Ravenou Yonah, we will be doing the world such a good thing by having this argument that we will actually have Orech Yamim and Orech Shanim added to our lives. And that's a good way of saying that when we think about years and days, we can end by saying not only that it's a privilege to learn with and from each other, and I'll thank Beit Avichai for the opportunity to do that, but that we really should all stay safe and healthy and live to see this very difficult and traumatic period be behind all of us. Thanks a lot for joining.